All right, so today we are discussing the West. And this is the time period you'll notice we're going to go back a little bit. I know this is from 1877 to the present, but we're going to go back to the end of the Civil War and pick up a little bit in talking about the West. This chapter, it covers opening of the West, Indians and resistance to expansion, the mining and lumber industries, the cattle industry and commercial farming, and then diversity in the far West. So we get to cover all those topics in this short little chapter. So let's jump right into it. So we're going to start off and we're going to talk about the Great Plains first and opening of the West. So as Americans were expanding westward in the post-Civil War era, so after the Civil War, their first frontier was located in the Great Plains region, lying on both sides of the Rocky Mountains and encompassing North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And we'll look at a map in just a second to kind of see that area. In 1878, geologist John Wesley Powell argued that the land beyond the plains was unsuitable for small-scale farming and contended that large farms would be better suited to the landscape. Other Americans held fast to the conventional belief that the plains could sustain small-scale farming with the right investment and ambition. So this is the area. So North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. This is the Great Plains area that we're talking about. Not so much all of Texas, kind of remember that. But this map also want to point out, these are major railroads in 1890. So if you go back and you look in the textbook, you look at the railroads that connected us pre-Civil War, you'll notice South didn't really have a lot of railroads. These are also railroads built by land grants that are here in the yellow, so meaning, the government stepped in and helped pay for those. But you'll notice we're a lot more connected after the Civil War than we were before the Civil War, and that's going to help a lot with the cattle industry. Keep that in mind as well. So, though there's a myth about the West, and it emphasizes the image of an individual farmer blazing a trail. The government and foreign investors, they offered incentives for settlers and companies to migrate and contribute to the development of the West. So the British were particularly essential to investing in the developing American West and provided essential funds for expanding the railroad systems, which we don't really think about that, but the British actually provided a lot of us of the funding in order to build those railroads. And that also helped foster the movement of people and industries. Then in 1862, Congress committed itself to supporting the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, providing railroad companies with vast areas of land to lay tracks or to sell, land in order to raise funds for construction. And the people that came over and actually helped with the building of these railroads were primarily the Chinese and Irish. They flooded into railroad building areas, and in 1869, construction crews working from opposite ends of the railway line met at Promontory Point in Utah, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad was an important symbol of American reunification. This is 4 years after the Civil War, the war that tore the country apart. This is kind of a symbolic bringing of the country back together. And it's also, those 2 points meeting, it was an essential component in the democratization, of the West. While the railroad, it did promote expansion, it also opened the door for corruption, particularly among Union Pacific promoters. And the Union Pacific, that is a railroad company in line. And they created a phony company called the Credit Mobilier. Then they used that company to steal government money and to bribe officials with. In Congress, they will expose these wrongdoers in 1872. And this is just an example of how, it doesn't matter what area you're in, there's always corruption, right? There's corruption in politics, there's corruption in big business, there's corruption, as we've even seen recently, in schools. So, they didn't escape it either. But that's why we're going to have laws put into place in order to hopefully end most of the corruption. So here's just a graph where you're showing the British foreign investment in the United States. So government bonds made up $525 million, railroads 559, and then 5%, $53 million that came from other funds. I know you can't see the other, but it's up here above the $53 million. And here's a picture of a railroad construction crew. You'll notice they dress differently than most Americans at the time. It's because they are Chinese immigrant workers who came over. So one thing, I don't know if we're going to discuss it, I can't remember exactly when this is discussed, but is the Opium Wars that happened. And this was going on between the British and the Chinese. And the Opium Wars got so bad in China that a lot of the Chinese fled that war and ended up immigrating to the United States. 1800s is when that takes place, and so that's when we have such an influx of Chinese coming in and working on the railroads, was to escape that war. Let's talk about Indians and resistance to expansion. So when Americans moved westward, they entered territory that was already populated by a range of Native American groups and also by Mexicans that had been living there. Remember, we had to fight a war with Mexico in order to gain the rest of what we now consider the western part of the United States. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, those people living there that were Mexican citizens were not considered U.S. citizens, but they still... Today, we're going to put some modern terms on it today. They would identify as Mexican. Although they're Mexican American citizens, they would identify as Mexican. And so those groups were also in that area, along with the natives. The Native American groups that lived west of the Mississippi included tribes that had been in the region for centuries, even prior to European conquest, prior to the Spanish coming and taking that part of North America. As well as tribes that had been removed from the eastern United States earlier in the 19th century being the 1800s. Each native group adapted to the land in a way that reflected its own cultural values, and of course the climate played into that, natural landscape. For example, the Pueblos irrigated the land, while the Pawnees burned the land to create regenerative agriculture. All Indian peoples were impacted by the arrival of Europeans. Hunting grounds were trampled. Water was polluted by runoff from mines, and Europeans carried with them new diseases to which Indians had no resistance. Just to give you an idea of where these major Native American tribes are, here they are in the red. This is the Indian tribes. Also, we're going to talk about the bison, so just kind of take note of the expanse of the migration range of the bison. Chief Joseph, this is also important from the Nez Perce. He's going to try to escape assimilation and white culture, and he's going to make it almost to the Canadian border, where they'd gotten over that border, they would have been free, but unfortunately that's where they are captured. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So, each tribe had unique interactions with Europeans and Americans as they expanded westward. The Plains Indians participated and trained with Americans, and many native groups engaged in violent conflicts with one another and with Americans. We know this. Most Native American groups practiced a common style of living and rejected private ownership of land, believing that all of nature was connected and interdependent, and you couldn't own it. Indian society it depended on bison, or the American buffalo, which provided meat, material to construct shelter and clothes, bones for tools and weapons, and dung for fuel. Yep, that's right. Poop for fuel. The bison's central role in Indian culture also laid the foundation for Native American spiritual traditions. Gender divisions in Indian society were a defining feature of daily life. Men rode horses to hunt, and women processed the bison when the men returned. Women were empowered by their role in feeding, clothing, and sheltering their tribespeople. In the mid-19th century, the federal government treated Indian groups as autonomous nations, which facilitated treaty making. The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which created designated areas for tribes on the Northern Plains, was intended to keep white encroachment at bay. You stay to your area, and whites will stay to their area, and that way we won't have white settlers coming onto your land. But then in 1853, the treaty was expanded to cover tribes on the Southern Plains as well. As normal, white settlers ignored the treaty and pushed onto Indian land, and on November 29, 1864, at Sand Creek, Colorado, a peaceful group of 700 Cheyennes and Arapahoes who believed they were under U.S. protection were attacked by Colonel John Chivington and his troops. In spite of the Indians raising a white flag of surrender, Chivington's troops scalped and killed about 270 Indian women and children, prompting a congressional investigation. The U.S. government faced a backlash for the Sand Creek Massacre as the Lakota Sioux led a series of Indian wars throughout the Central Plains in the late 1860s. The two sides are going to end up signing a second Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, which allowed northern tribes to control parts of Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. Another treaty placed the southern tribes in a new reservation in western Oklahoma. The Nez Perce settled in a section of the Oklahoma Reservation after being pushed into a treaty in which they relinquished most of their territory in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho to the United States. Their chief, Chief Joseph, led his people in a grueling march into Montana and Wyoming with the intention of going to Canada. But as I pointed out on that map, that group is intercepted by federal troops. They're stopped from going to Canada, and they are removed from their lands and placed in Oklahoma. In response to Chief Joseph's efforts at mobilizing the political system to live up to its promise and treaties, Congress helped the Nez Perce return to a reservation in Washington. In spite of the negotiations that benefited them, violence and conflict continued, and General William Tecumseh Sherman ordered his troops to push Indians off their land by destructive force. In November of 1868, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer massacred more than 100 Cheyennes. Almost a decade later, the Lakota Sioux took revenge by killing Custer and his troops at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, an assault that triggered violent retribution from the U.S. Army. Among the U.S. troops were African Americans who participated in Indian wars as an opportunity to find new and lucrative opportunities to work in the West. These so-called Buffalo Soldiers included Sergeant George Jordan of the 9th Cavalry, who in 1880 earned a Congressional Medal of Honor for fighting off Apache raiders in New Mexico. So Buffalo Soldiers, those are African Americans. So there's a really probably infamous song by Bob Marley, Buffalo Soldier. Listen to it. So in spite of their skill at warfare, Indian tribes stood little chance against the U.S. Army's superior transportation and communication technologies and its seemingly unlimited weaponry. The long history of tension among competing Indian tribes weakened their collective position against the United States. Alongside the violence and political repression, the decimation of native culture and rapidly declining bison population, that's going to diminish their ability to wage war. Gold also drove American settlers into territories that treaties had previously set aside for native use, but as soon as they find gold, like in the Black Hills of the Dakotas, they're going to go in and ignore those treaties, and whites are going to go in and take over that land. Doesn't matter about the treaty. And that's going to, of course, lead to more conflict. Congress encouraged white homesteaders to move into Indian territories, or to territory Indians had occupied, like in western Oklahoma. And this is like in 1889, we had the Oklahoma land rushes. And the government's encouraging people to just go in and take the land. So though the U.S. Army, settlers, and industry investors were interested mainly in removing Native Americans from the path of American expansion, reformers prompted a different Indian policy that embraced assimilation as a piece to path. So think about assimilation, trying to assimilate into white culture. It's going to be really hard for Native Americans to do that. In 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson, she was a key advocate of Indian policy reform. She published a treatise on injustices perpetrated against Indians called Century of Dishonor, which inspired the Women's National Indian Association and other groups to begin this push for better treatment of Native Americans. While many of the Indian policy reforms decimated Native cultural heritage, they also offered a gentler approach, condemning violence in favor of cultural assimilation that would help natives become more like white Americans. Forget your ancestry, forget your past, just become white. Everything will be easier. That's what they're promoting. Lewis Morgan, who wrote Ancient Society in 1877, he believed that Indians were savages and barbarians, but that they could become civilized by embracing white culture, because apparently white culture is the only civilized culture, according to Lewis Morgan. His ideology influenced men like Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian School to assimilate Indians. Some Americans rejected the doctrine of assimilation, believing that Native Americans had inborn traits incompatible with civilization, but the reform movement nonetheless had sway in politics. We would see this as ludicrous today, and I hope you can hear through the sarcasm in my voice how just ridiculous this was. The politician with the most influence on Indian policy reforms was Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, who promoted the assimilation and Christianization of Native Americans through individual land ownership. So in 1887, the Dawes Act, what it did is it divided Indian land into 160-acre parcels, each of which would go to an individual family. At the end of 25 years, Indians who lived on these parcels would earn American citizenship in exchange for abandoning the practice of cultural rights, their native religion, their oral traditions, no longer allowed to speak their own language, the use of medicine men, and the remaining land after this relocation would go up for sale to support Indian education. The Dawes Act was a failure. First, because Indians were provided with inadequate tools for farming, and second, because whites profited off the sale of land to the detriment of Indians. Land ownership among Indians declined from about 155 million acres in 1881 to about 77 million acres by 1897. Assimilation efforts also increased tensions by forcing parents to send their children to boarding schools, where they were stripped of their Indian cultural markers and Americanized. Not allowed to wear their own clothing, not allowed to go by their name that their parents had given them. They were not allowed to wear their hair long. Their hair was cut. So all of that cultural heritage, all of that, their past, was completely taken and stripped from them. So in the schooling, it failed to create equality for Indian children. So some Indians resisted cultural assimilation and individual ownership of land, while others, such as Oisa, a Lakota, also known as Charles Eastman, embraced the process of assimilation, but he was able to remain loyal to Indian cultural heritage. And he's one of the few who is actually, they published his writings. He's one of the few Indian writers that we have from the 1800s. And they kind of, like, his family came over and they wanted to be homesteaders. They didn't want to be under the thumb of an Indian agent. So they kind of broke out on their own. And that's kind of the lineage that he followed as well. We also have another prophet. If you'll remember back from the first half of the course, we've had several Indian prophets that we've talked about, but this is Prophet Wovoka of the Paiute tribe, and he devised one of the most distinctive forms of resistance to assimilation. You've probably heard of it before, but it's called the ghost dance, and that would allow Indians to reestablish control and force whites to disappear. And the ghost dance, it spread among the Lakota Sioux tribes in the Northern Plains region. And what the ghost dance did, it drew the ire, right? It made them mad, the U.S. Army, which saw it as a sign of renewed resistance. And on December 29th of 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, a confrontation between the 7th Cavalry and a group of Lakota ghost dancers resulted in the deaths of some 250 Native Americans. The Wounded Knee Massacre, that really cemented the United States investment in destroying Native American culture entirely. And I want to go back for just a second and talk more about the ghost dance. So the ghost dance that they're performing, this would be like a religious, it's a ritual like dance it's kind of based on a circle dance where they would all line up in a circle and move typically to the left. Sometimes they would start off moving to the right, but just depending on the nation and exactly what the ceremony is for. But this would be like a religious experience. And so for some of you, that might be like when you go to church, or if you go to like a youth conference and you all of a sudden you feel this, what we would maybe call the Holy Spirit. It's kind of the same equivalent to that. It's like this feeling of your ancestors of the past, that you're somehow connecting to them spiritually, even emotionally. So there's a lot of religious and ritual that goes into the ghost dance. And because of that, they were seen as troublemakers when they would perform this ghost dance, because it was trying to bring back that memory of the past and to reconnect them to their past. And so because they're seen as troublemakers, that's when we're going to see resistance to that by the U.S. military. And that kind of leads to the Wounded Knee Massacre. Okay, Let's talk about something not so heavy, maybe, the business of mining. So mining and lumber industries, and let's talk about the Comstock lode. So this is in the Sierra Nevada, and it provided one of the biggest draws in the gold rush west. And it attracted an international group of men, all trying to get in on this where this gold was found. A lot of these men came from the United States, but we do have some from Mexico and China as well. These men initially mined for gold and silver really on an individual basis. So they would get all the tools that they needed and they would go out and try to get rich on their own. But as the supply became increasingly difficult to access because you needed dynamite to blow part of the mountain away, or you needed like bigger, stronger mining tools that they just couldn't do by themselves or couldn't even afford, then that's when these big businesses are going to take over the mining industry. Mining was dangerous and poorly paid work that led to some 300 deaths between 1863 and 1880, and accidents left many men unable to work and without any financial resources. The mining industry fostered the creation of unions, and that's kind of a foreign concept here in Texas because we're an at-will work state, meaning you can be fired for no reason, really. We don't have the power of unions. We do here in the city of Paris. There are unions at some of our big companies that we have, like out at Kimberly-Clark, but it's not mandatory unit membership. So the idea of a union, can be a good thing, and unions are gonna, try to help these miners. Like if you're hurt on the job, you still get compensation. You get like workers' comp for being hurt on the job, or if you're no longer able to work, then you have to be paid disability because maybe your legs were accidentally blown off. And so that's what unions are going to work for, the creation of those unions. And they really came out of the Comstock lode areas, and they are going to encounter violent resistance from mining companies, of course, from private police forces like the Pinkertons, and state militias that were politically entangled with mining companies. In 1892, the Idaho governor deployed the National Guard to crush a strike. 7 workers were killed. The following year, mine workers formed the Western Federation of Miners, and it was a powerful but really exclusive union that did not include Chinese, Mexican, and Indian workers. So although we have these unions that are there to protect workers, they are kind of sometimes exclusive in who they will protect. They won't protect all the workers. You have to be white, you have to be man, you have to be, those kind of things. There are those qualifiers to sometimes join unions. Life in the mining towns, women would enter these mining towns alongside men, making up as much as half the population in towns, such as like Story County, Nevada. Most worked as domestics in hotels, like domestic maids, or they would work, like at the front counter, that kind of thing. They would work in homes, cleaning houses, doing the laundry. They would also work in boarding houses, and sometimes they would even work as prostitutes, which presented significant danger and health risks to young women who really didn't have another choice in order to survive. I love this picture that your book has. These are some prostitutes on the frontier. Not really what I would picture when I picture prostitutes. That's why I love this picture so much. And of course the saloon, the bar workers there with them. But industries that supported the lifestyles of miners boomed. So your taverns, your brothels, your opium dens, and boarding houses proved important to sustaining mining towns. But when the gold and silver started to disappear, so did the towns too. Some mining towns, there's one in Montana, they are able to survive, and the inhabitants established families, built neighborhoods, divided themselves by class and ethnicity, creating communities that resembled those back east. Even here in Texas, if you start driving and you get on like Interstate 20 and you go out west, you'll hit like Ranger, and you'll hit like Cisco, places like that. Those are once huge oil boom towns. We didn't have a lot of mining, but oil towns. And after the oil dried up, so did the town. Same thing was happening out west. You have a lot of ghost towns now because the mining industry, like all the gold and silver, was gone, and so the town was deserted as well. The boom in the mining industry created a huge demand for timber also, and by 1900, a few large companies came to dominate the industry, buying huge tracts of land and turning it into an international business. The consolidation of large lumber companies did not help the sawmill workers. It was an extremely dangerous profession, largely done by workers from Scandinavia. If If you know where Scandinavia is, it's like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, that area. Also during this time, we're going to see the rise of the cowboy, especially as we're moving into the frontier. And what we have come to kind of symbolize or see with cowboys is they symbolize the frontier West as independent, mainly honorable defenders of female virtue who were essential to taming the Wild West. Cowboy life defied the myths, though, as wages were low, work was monotonous, conditions could be dangerous, and long, hard days were spent pushing cattle on the long drive, a 1,500-mile trek along the Chisholm Trail. While most cowboys were white Southerners, blacks and Mexicans also made a life out of tending cattle, though they faced racial discrimination and pay discrepancies. They were not paid equal for the same work. The cowboys' grueling work made large-scale ranchers rich, and the expansion of the railroad systems, along with the creation of the refrigerated railroad cars, that also enabled the burgeoning of a beef market in the East. As the cattle industry grew, fewer than 40 ranchers held more than 20 million acres of land. One ranch in Texas alone spanned 200 miles and stocked 150,000 steers each year. By the middle of the 1880s, the industry was an essential part of the national economy. The rapid growth of the ranching industry was a harbinger of economic decline. Oversupply drove prices down. Argentina and Canada provided competition, and increasing settlement in the West divided much of the open range into individual homesteads. Between 1885 and 1887, cold winters and a summer drought led to the destruction of a vast majority of the cattle in the Northern Plains region, and the cattle industry is going to suffer dramatically. Economic power in the ranching industry was increasingly consolidated into the hands of a few powerful individuals, and cowboys became laborers. The U.S. government, it does provide incentives to farmers who wanted to move west, and in the midst of the Civil War, the Republican-controlled Congress passed the Homestead Act. This number is kind of, how like in certain books numbers are repeated? I'm thinking of the Bible specifically, like the number 7, the number 40, 160, for some reason, that's the number of acres we allot to individuals in the United States. But 160 acres was distributed among Western settlers. Initially, farmers saw success in the West, but the climate was unsuited to the type of farming envisioned by homesteaders. Technology improved farmers' prospects, and they utilized important wheat from Russia, new machines designed to allow farmers to plow land more easily, and equipment that allowed farmers to have improved access to water. The farmers who ended up in the West were from a range of backgrounds. About 1/3 of those who migrated to the Northern Plains were immigrants. Incentives for movement to the West included opportunities with railroad companies in addition to farming, and the two industries supported one another in the project of developing the West. The railroad industry used advertising to lure prospective settlers onto the rail lines, enticing them with descriptions of the potential of the West and with discount rail fares. Family members were also essential to populating the West, as settlers described their adventures and prospects in letters to relatives back east, and that made more people want to move and migrate. Homes in the West were typically constructed of sod, dirt essentially, and were dark, damp, and often intruded upon by pests and rain that leaked through the roof. Outside conditions were not much better because, droughts and a plague of grasshoppers in the 1870s destroyed much of the vegetation, and extreme temperatures made the experience of settling the plains difficult. They thought it was going to be easy, and they figured out it was not. This is like sometimes a harsh land to try to grow and cultivate on. Women homesteaders, so women, that were also moving out west, they bore responsibility for keeping the house comfortable, which is kind of hard to do, and also contributed to the economic welfare of the family by taking in boarders, like people coming in and like renting a room or renting a bed essentially, and selling goods such as milk, butter, and eggs. It also was not unusual for women to claim a homestead for themselves in order to take advantage of a potential economic opportunity or to support a family after their husband's death. Across 9 counties in the Dakotas, more than 4,400 women owned land. Women in the West also served as a force for democracy and reform on the frontier by advocating for temperance, also meaning abstaining from alcohol. And in the late 1870s, women in Kansas joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which campaigned for an amendment against the sale of liquor. Temperance in the West fed into other movements that drew women into politics. In 1884, women in Kansas established the Equal Suffrage Association, which in 1887 succeeded in winning women the right to vote and to run for office in municipal elections. That was a huge win for women before we have the 19th Amendment. There's just some women at work in Kansas. For farmers, economic success was often elusive. I think most of you can maybe know someone that's a farmer, or you can see this as well. Few were able to self-sustain off the land, and most relied on barter or short-term credit to buy the land and machinery necessary to survive. Farmers emphasized cash staples like corn and wheat instead of crops that would sustain their families, and their economic stability depended on prices of those crops as determined by the international market. So when corn and wheat prices fell, corn growers used their excess crops to fatten up hogs and sell them for a bigger profit. Wheat growers were more susceptible to fluctuations in the market, however, and many abandoned their farms during hard times and moved to cities. Over the second half of the 19th century, the farming industry, like the mining industry, was increasingly consolidated into the hands of big businessmen who commercialized farming. Just as it had provided incentives to individual farmers, the federal government also provided incentives to big business. We have the Desert Land Act, which offered 640 acres to settlers who would irrigate the land. Was impractical for small homesteaders, so larger companies are going to be able to benefit from that. The Timber and Stone Act, they sold forest land parcels. Here it is again, 160 acres for $2.50 an acre, which lumber companies jumped at using dummy entrymen to file claims and transferring the titles to the companies. So basically what they would do is they would find an individual, put the land in their name, but really that land was owned by the company. It wasn't owned by that person. So kind of, again, scamming to get more land. We're going to skip over because although the Mormons are important, it is a religious group, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I don't ask you a whole lot of questions about this group and their differences because I think we kind of categorize them unfairly. So we're going to skip over this part and we're going to go to diversity and talking about Californios. So the west coast of the United States, that was inhabited by Native Americans as well, by Spanish and Mexican farmers and ranchers known as Californios, who had technically acquired American citizenship. We've talked about this. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, so they were granted citizenship in 1849 technically, after that treaty was signed in 1848. Though they were U.S. citizens, they had to pay a foreign miners tax. And although they're landowners, they lost much of their land because, according to Anglo politicians, they did not use the land efficiently. By the end of the 19th century, 2/3 of all land formerly belonging to the Californios was in Anglo hands, and they suffered the effects of poverty. They were forced into poorly paying jobs, lost significant influence in the politics and economics of the region. Spanish and Mexican inhabitants of the Southwest met a similar fate, but they fought back by forming a group called the Whitecaps, which in 1889 and 1890 burned Anglo property and railroads. I didn't notice it actually gives you the Spanish. I did the translation, I'm sorry. It's Las Gorras Blancas. Those are the Whitecaps. They were nonetheless overpowered by the influx of white settlers, unfortunately. But this is a group that they're trying to take back the land that is rightfully theirs, that was stolen from them. So yes, they are seen as a vigilante group, but they're not successful in trying to take back their land. Here is a depiction of the Rock Springs Massacre. You'll notice, I'm sure you can tell, this is a massacre that was carried out against Chinese immigrants. And so the last thing we're going to talk about from this chapter is are the Chinese. So Chinese immigrants were drawn to California and the West Coast in the wave of migration away from conflict and poverty in China. The Opium Wars was one of those. That also brought Chinese settlers to not just here to America, but they also went to Australia, they went to Hawaii, they also went to Latin America. Chinese immigrants first settled in California during the 1848 gold rush and later worked on the Transcontinental Railroad. We saw a picture of them earlier working on that railroad. And by 1880, 200,000 mostly male Chinese settlers lived in the West and had established culturally Chinese communities. However, we do see anti-Chinese settlement was high in the West, and whites routinely blamed economic difficulties on the Chinese, arguing that their willingness of the Chinese to work for low wages made it impossible for white workers to get better pay, and that the Chinese were racially inferior. By the 1870s, anti-Chinese sentiment had morphed into a political movement with significant influence. The Working Men's Party started boycotts of Chinese-made products and endorsed laws that restricted Chinese labor, and vigilantes engaged in violence, arson, and vandalism in an effort to intimidate Chinese settlers. Anti-Chinese sentiment had influence at the federal level as well, and in 1882, Congress responded to pressure by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act. And what that did is it banned further Chinese immigration and also barred the Chinese who were already in the United States from becoming citizens. In spite of the legislation which cut off Chinese immigration until the Second World War, violence continued in the mid-1880s as whites pushed the Chinese out of mining towns and cities across the West. And this is just a political cartoon about Indians becoming civilized, so to speak. And so you can look at in your book more of that. So what I want to end this on is, we kind of put a myth to the West, and we idolize and romanticize the West a lot. But in reality, the West was a harsh place, and you really couldn't do it on your own. If the government had not stepped in and provided land grants and opportunities for people to settle the West, we would have never settled the West, so to say. And the pioneers, they didn't fully understand the land and the people that they encountered. And I think your book does a good job of explaining that, or trying to explain that. Also, we have the complete annihilation of some tribes, of some cultures that are completely lost to us because of white settlement in the West. And trying to get those back has proved unsuccessful so far. So as we move forward, we're going to move on past the West. And in chapter 16, we're going to talk a little bit about city life and what it was like in industrial America, like back out towards the East Coast, because we don't have a lot of industry going on too much in the West. So that's what chapter 16 will include. So stay tuned for that one.